July 31st, 1944. 49 degrees north latitude, 7 degrees west longitude, 30 miles west of the Scilly Isles. Lieutenant Commander Sidney Darling, commanding officer of HMS Loch Killin, stood in the operations room watching the ASDIC operator's face. The frigate's sonar had solid contact on a submerged submarine at 400 yards, bearing 270 degrees, depth estimate 90 feet. German submarine U-333 was attempting a crash dive, her commander betting everything on the same tactic that had saved his boat dozens of times before. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Get deep. Turn hard. Wait for the British ship to pass overhead and lose contact, then evade while the depth charges detonated harmlessly behind you. It was the doctrine that had kept U-boats alive through 3 years of Atlantic warfare. German submariners had learned to read the patterns of British anti-submarine attacks the way experienced soldiers read artillery fire. First came the ASDIC pings, that distinctive metallic echo bouncing off your pressure hull. Then the sound would fade as the attacking ship closed to within 200 yards, the ASD beam unable to detect targets at point-blank range. That silence was your warning. You had maybe 30 seconds while the escort vessel passed directly overhead, 30 seconds to put distance between your boat and your last known position. Then the depth charges would start falling, rolling off the stern rails and firing from the throwers, and if you'd maneuvered correctly, they'd detonate 100 yards away from where you'd gone to survive. U-333's crew had executed this drill successfully more times than anyone could count. The boat had sailed 12 combat patrols since August 1941. She'd survived depth charge attacks off Sierra Leone that had lasted 8 hours. She'd been rammed by British frigates on 3 separate occasions and lived to tell about it. Her commander, Kapitän-Leutnant Hans Fiedler, had taken over the boat just 11 days earlier, but his crew included veterans who'd been dodging British depth charges since the war's first year. They knew the drill. They drilled it until it became instinct. Listen for the ASDIC to fade, count to 10, hard rudder, change depth. The explosions would come, but they'd be distant, the shock waves dispersing through thousands of cubic meters of water before reaching your hull. Maybe some paint would flake off the bulkheads. Maybe a few light bulbs would shatter, but you'd survive. Then you'd creep away, submerged, battery power bleeding away with each passing hour, until you could surface safely and recharge. Except this time, the script was different. Darling gave the order at precisely 09:43 hours. Fire Squid. On Loch Killin's foredeck, 3 12-inch mortar barrels elevated to their fixed angle of 45 degrees. The barrels were mounted in series, one behind the other, angled slightly askew from each other in the mounting frame. The ASDIC operator had already fed the target's depth into the firing solution, 90 feet. The clockwork fuses on 3 390-pound projectiles had been automatically set to detonate at that exact depth. The mortars fired in rapid sequence, boom, 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 the recoil rocking the frigate's bow. 3 massive projectiles arced through the air, propelled by cordite charges that sent them 275 yards ahead of the ship. They hit the water in a triangular pattern, each bomb landing 40 yards from the others, forming an equilateral triangle with U-333 somewhere near its center. The projectiles sank at 43.5 feet per second. Their clockwork fuses ticked down with mechanical precision, counting the pressure as depth increased. At exactly 90 feet below the surface, all 3 charges detonated simultaneously, not in sequence, not spread over several seconds. Simultaneously. The effect was unlike anything conventional depth charges could produce. Each bomb carried a 207-pound Minol warhead, a mixture of ammonium nitrate, TNT, and aluminum powder that the British had developed when shortages of pure explosives forced improvisation. When 3 of these warheads detonated at the same instant at the same depth, their blast waves didn't just overlap, they converged. The pressure wave that hit U-333 came from 3 directions at once, crushing inward with synchronized force. The submarine's pressure hull, designed to withstand depth and the gradual pressure of sequential explosions, had no defense against convergent shock waves arriving in perfect coordination. The hull plates buckled inward amidships, rivets sheared, seams split. In the control room, Fiedler had perhaps 2 seconds to understand what had happened before freezing. Atlantic water exploded through ruptured seams. The boat's interior lighting failed instantly as seawater hit electrical panels. In absolute darkness, with water hammering through breaches in the pressure hull, 45 German submariners died within 90 seconds. Some drowned. Others were killed by the pressure differential as compartments flooded. A few may have died from the concussion itself, their internal organs ruptured by the convergent blast wave before the water even reached them. On Loch Killin's deck, the ASDIC operator reported breaking up noises. The distinctive sounds of a submarine's death, hull plates collapsing under pressure, internal bulkheads giving way, the groan of steel that was never meant to bend, bending anyway. Oil began spreading across the surface, a dark slick that grew wider with each passing minute. No survivors appeared. U-333 had gone from a functioning combat vessel to a metal coffin on the Atlantic floor in less time than it took to brew a pot of tea. What made this kill historically significant wasn't just that it had happened. British escorts had been sinking U-boats for years. What mattered was how it had happened. This was the first confirmed kill using a weapon system that the Royal Navy's leadership had rushed into service just 14 months earlier over the explicit objections of experienced anti-submarine warfare officers. A weapon that violated every established doctrine about how to hunt submarines. A weapon that some captains had actively refused to have installed on their ships because they believed it would make them less effective, not more. The weapon was called Squid, and its development represented a fundamental rethinking of how to kill submarines based on one simple observation that should have been obvious from the war's first day, but somehow wasn't. If you want to sink a submarine, you need to hit it while you can still see it on sonar. You've got to understand something about depth charge attacks, as they were practiced from 1939 through 1943. The entire doctrine was built around a fundamental tactical problem that nobody had figured out how to solve. ASDIC, the British sonar system, could detect submarines at ranges up to 2,000 yards under good conditions. An escort ship would pick up a contact, classify it as hostile, and begin its attack run. The ship would speed up to 15 or 20 knots, racing toward the submarine's position, while the ASDIC operator called out ranges: 1,500 yards, 1,000 yards, 500 yards. The submarine commander, hearing the ASD pings intensify, would order a crash dive and evasive maneuvers. The attacking ship would charge forward, the ASD operator's voice growing more urgent as the range decreased. 300 yards, 200 yards, and then, at approximately 200 yards, the ASDIC contact would fade, and then vanish entirely. The submarine had entered the ASDIC's blind spot, an area directly beneath and ahead of the attacking ship, where the sonar beam couldn't reach. From 200 yards in to 0 yards, passing directly over the submarine, the attacking ship was completely blind. The submarine it had been tracking had effectively vanished. This blind approach lasted typically 30 to 40 seconds, depending on the escort's speed. 30 to 40 seconds, where the submarine could turn, change depth, alter course in any direction, and the attacking ship would have no idea what it was doing. The standard British response was to saturate the area with explosives and hope something hit. Escorts would roll depth charges off stern racks while simultaneously firing them from throwers mounted on the sides of the ship. A typical pattern involved 10 depth charges, set to detonate at different depths, covering an area astern of the ship roughly 200 feet wide and 300 feet long. The idea was that even if the submarine maneuvered, it probably stayed within that general area, and the overlapping explosions might damage or destroy it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The problem was that submarines were small targets in a very large ocean, and explosions in water lose their force rapidly with distance. A depth charge detonating 50 feet from a submarine might crack some hull plates. The same charge detonating 75 feet away might just rattle the crew and break some instruments. At 100 feet, it was loud and scary, but probably wouldn't cause serious damage. German submarine commanders had learned this through brutal experience. They'd developed detailed manuals documenting exactly how to evade depth charge attacks. The tactics were surprisingly sophisticated. First rule, the moment ASDIC contact intensified, meaning an attack was incoming, crash dive to below 200 feet if possible. Most British depth charges in early war were set for shallow detonation, 100 to 150 feet, because that's where submarines typically operated while making attacks. Getting deep brought you safety. Second rule. The instant the ASDIC pings stopped, meaning you'd entered the blind zone, alter course by at least 30 degrees. The British ship would pass overhead, still moving in the direction you were going when it lost contact. If you'd turned hard left or right in those 30 seconds of blindness, the depth charges rolling off its stern would detonate along a line that you were no longer following. Third rule, vary your depth. Don't stay at the depth the enemy last detected you. Go 50 feet deeper or 50 feet shallower. The depth charges were set for where you were, not where you're going to be. Fourth rule, if you hear multiple ships attacking, which meant a coordinated attack from several escorts, go silent. Shut down all non-essential equipment, stop the engines, let the boat drift. The British used multiple ships to triangulate your position based on your sound signature. No sound, no triangulation. German training emphasized that British depth charge attacks followed predictable patterns. The escort would make its run, drop its charges, then turn to make another pass while reloading. This gave you a window, typically 2 to 3 minutes, to maneuver further from your last position before the next attack came. Experienced U-boat crews could survive hundreds of depth charges if they followed the doctrine. The German submarine U-427 held the record, surviving 678 depth charges during a marathon attack in April 1945. 678 explosions, and the boat made it home. The British Admiralty had statistics on this, and the numbers were genuinely depressing. During World War II, British escorts made 5,174 depth charge attacks on submarines. Those attacks resulted in 85.5 kills. The half kill came from shared credit when multiple ships attacked the same submarine. Do the math. That's a ratio of 60.5 attacks for every submarine sunk, 60.5 attacks. You needed to find a submarine 60 times on average, execute a perfect attack run 60 times, drop thousands of pounds of high explosive into the ocean 60 times, and you might sink one U-boat. This wasn't warfare. This was an expensive way to scare submarines while depleting your own ammunition stocks. The problem wasn't that British crews were incompetent. The problem was that the submarine had 30 seconds of invisibility to evade while the attacking ship was running blind. Those 30 seconds made all the difference. The solution required changing the fundamental geometry of the attack. Instead of passing over the submarine before dropping charges, you needed to hit it while you still had ASDIC contact, which meant throwing the charges forward while the submarine was still visible on sonar. Forward-throwing weapons. They weren't a new idea. The Royal Navy had experimented with ahead-throwing mortars in World War I, but the technology wasn't mature enough to be practical. Between the wars, the problem was mostly forgotten because submarine doctrine assumed surface fleets would be the primary threat and long-range gunfire would be the primary response. Then World War II started, and suddenly hundreds of U-boats were operating in the Atlantic, and the old depth charge doctrine wasn't working. The Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, unofficially nicknamed the Wheezers and Dodgers by the rest of the Navy, started working on forward-throwing weapons in 1940. The Wheezers and Dodgers was a peculiar organization. It had been created specifically to develop unconventional weapons that didn't fit into traditional naval categories. The people staffing it were an odd mix of civilian engineers, retired officers brought back for their specialized knowledge, and active duty. officers who were considered too creative or too unorthodox for conventional commands. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, Royal Artillery, had developed something called a spigot mortar before the war. It was a weird weapon where the propellant charge was in the weapon itself, and the projectile had a hollow tail that slid over a steel rod, the spigot. When the charge fired, the expanding gases pushed against the inside of the projectile's tail, launching it forward. The design had several advantages over conventional mortars. You could fire different size projectiles from the same launcher just by changing the tail diameter. You didn't need to carry separate propellant charges for each projectile, and the weapon could be much lighter than a conventional mortar of equivalent power. Blacker's design had been adapted for infantry use as the Blacker Bombard and later as the PI anti-tank weapon. The Weasers and Dodgers took Blacker's spigot principle and scaled it up for naval use. The result was Hedgehog, a weapon that looked exactly like its name suggested. 24 spigot mortars mounted in rows on a steel frame, the empty spigots sticking up like the spines on a hedgehog's back. Each projectile weighed 65 pounds with a 35-pound Torpex warhead. When fired, all 24 projectiles would arc through the air and land in a circular pattern about 250 yards ahead of the ship. Here's where Hedgehog got clever. The projectiles used contact fuses, not time or depth fuses. They only exploded if they actually hit something solid, like a submarine hull. This solved two problems simultaneously. First, if you missed, the ASDIC wasn't disrupted by explosions. Conventional depth charges created massive turbulence and noise in the water when they detonated, making it impossible to maintain ASDIC contact for several minutes after an attack. Hedgehog projectiles that missed just sank to the bottom without exploding. You could immediately make another attack without waiting for the water to settle. Second, if a Hedgehog projectile did explode, you knew you'd hit something. A contact explosion directly against a pressure hull was far more lethal than even a near miss with a conventional depth charge. The water's cushioning effect that let U-boats survive depth charges at 75 feet didn't apply when the explosive was pressed directly against the hull when it detonated. Hedgehog entered service in 1942, and after crews got over their initial skepticism and learned how to use it properly, the results were impressive. 268 Hedgehog attacks resulted in 47 submarine kills. That's a ratio of 5.7 attacks per kill versus 60.5 for conventional depth charges. 10 times more effective. Hedgehog worked, but it had limitations. The projectiles were small, only 35 pounds of explosive. You needed a direct hit to get a kill. If you missed by even a few feet, the submarine survived undamaged. There was no near-miss effect, no cumulative damage from multiple explosions like you got with conventional depth charges. And some officers argued that Hedgehog actually reduced the psychological pressure on U-boat crews. With conventional depth charges, even when they missed, the submarine crew endured hours of explosions, each one a reminder they might die in the next few seconds. The psychological toll was severe. With Hedgehog, if the projectiles missed, they just sank silently. No explosions meant no terror. The U-boat crew might not even realize they'd been attacked. The Weasers and Dodgers started working on Hedgehog's replacement before Hedgehog had even finished its sea trials. They wanted something that combined Hedgehog's forward-throwing capability with the devastating effect of large depth charges. In 1942, they went back to the drawing board. The weapon they designed was fundamentally different from anything that had come before. Instead of 24 small projectiles, they'd use 3 large ones. Instead of contact fuses, they'd use clockwork depth fuses synchronized to the ASDIC reading. Instead of trying to hit the submarine directly, they'd create a converging pressure wave that would crush the hull. The technical challenges were significant. First, the mortars had to be powerful enough to throw a 390-pound projectile 275 yards. That required substantial propellant charges and a very robust mounting system. Second, the 3 projectiles had to land in a precise triangular pattern. This meant the 3 mortar barrels couldn't be parallel. They had to be angled slightly away from each other, carefully calculated so the projectiles' ballistic trajectories would create the right spacing at the right range. Third, the clockwork fuses had to be reliable and accurate. You were setting them to detonate at a specific depth within 900 feet of water. The mechanism had to count pressure precisely while tumbling through water, then initiate the explosion within a 1-second window. And fourth, all of this had to be automated as much as possible. In combat, you didn't have time for manual calculations and adjustments. The ASDIC operator tracking the submarine needed to be able to transfer depth information directly to the weapon system. The weapon went from drawing board to prototype in less than 8 months. By May 1943, a pre-production model had been installed on HMS Ambuscade, a destroyer, for sea trials. The installation was technically still prototype testing. The system hadn't been fully evaluated. There were concerns about the mounting's strength under repeated firing, questions about whether the clockwork fuses were reliable enough for combat use, and doubts about whether the triangular pattern would actually work as designed. Standard naval weapons acquisition would have required another year of testing, evaluation, modifications, and retesting before the weapon entered service. The Admiralty didn't have another year. U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. The mid-Atlantic gap remained uncovered by air patrols. Convoy losses in the first quarter of 1943 had reached crisis levels. The order came down: install Squid on every new frigate and corvette coming off the building ways, train crews on the weapon during shakedown cruises, work out the problems in actual combat. The first production Squid installation went on HMS Hadley Castle, a corvette, in late 1943. By the time HMS Loch Killin was launched on November 29, 1943, Squid was standard equipment on the new Loch-class frigates. These ships had been designed specifically around anti-submarine warfare, incorporating every lesson learned from 3 years of Atlantic fighting. The Loch class represented a complete rethinking of escort vessel design. Previous escorts had been built on merchant ship hulls or modified destroyer designs. The Lochs were purpose-built from the keel up for hunting submarines. They had improved ASDIC with better range and resolution. They had Type 277 radar for surface search. They had 2 Squid mountings, 6 barrels total, allowing them to fire 2 triangular patterns simultaneously. And they had the crew training and weapons doctrine to use all this equipment effectively. But some senior officers remained skeptical. Captain Kenneth Adams, Royal Canadian Navy, explicitly opposed fitting Squid to escorts under his command. His reasoning was tactical and strategic. Installing Squid required removing gun armament. A typical installation meant sacrificing 1 or 2 4-inch guns and several smaller anti-aircraft weapons to make space and weight for the Squid mortars and their ammunition. This, Adams argued, made the ships unsuitable for fleet actions. If escort vessels encountered enemy surface ships or had to provide gunfire support during amphibious operations, they'd be defensively weak without their full gun battery. Adams's concern reflected a deeper institutional divide within the Royal Navy. Traditional naval doctrine emphasized balanced capability. A ship should be able to perform multiple roles, fight multiple types of enemy, respond to various tactical situations. Specialized anti-submarine vessels gave up that flexibility. They became good at exactly one thing: killing submarines, and potentially vulnerable to everything else. The Admiralty overruled Adams. Specialized anti-submarine warfare was worth the trade-off. If you're engaged by enemy surface ships, you run. If you need gunfire support capability, assign a different type of vessel. The escort's job was to sink U-boats, and Squid gave them the best tool available for that mission. HMS Loch Killin completed sea trials in April 1944. Lieutenant Commander Sidney Darling, Royal Australian Naval Volunteer Reserve, took command. Darling was an interesting choice. He wasn't regular Navy. He was volunteer reserve, meaning he'd been a civilian before the war. But he'd proven himself in anti-submarine operations, earning a Distinguished Service Cross and Bar for actions while commanding previous escorts. The Navy was promoting based on competence and results rather than peacetime credentials, and Darling had both. After weapons tests and crew training exercises, Loch Killin joined the 2nd Escort Group at Liverpool on June 1, 1944. D-Day was 5 days away. The 2nd Escort Group's mission was to prevent U-boats from interfering with Operation Neptune, the naval phase of the Normandy landings. German submarines operating from French bases might attempt to attack the massive invasion fleet crossing the Channel. They might try to intercept supply convoys, bringing reinforcements and equipment to the beachhead. Or they might simply try to disrupt Allied operations by forcing the commitment of escorts and air patrols to hunt them. Loch Killin and the 2nd Escort Group patrolled the southwestern approaches, the ocean area between Cornwall and Brittany, hunting for U-boats trying to reach the invasion zone. On July 31st, intelligence detected multiple U-boat contacts in an area west of the Scilly Isles. HMS Starling, a sloop, and Loch Killin were vectored to investigate. Starling made initial contact at 08:32 hours. Asdic had a solid return, classified as submarine, range 1,200 yards, bearing 110 degrees, depth estimated shallow. The submarine was U-333, a Type Sevi IC boat that had been at sea for 8 days. Her commander, Kapitänleutnant Hans Fiedler, had taken command just 11 days earlier, on July 20th, replacing the boat's longtime commander, Kapitänleutnant Peter Erik Kremer. Kremer had left to commission one of the new Type XXI Electroboats, the revolutionary submarine design that Germany hoped would regain the advantage in the Atlantic. Fiedler's first patrol as commander was supposed to be a standard operation, intercept Allied supply convoys heading toward France. Sink what you can, evade the escorts, return to base. Except nothing about U-boat operations in July 1944 was standard anymore. Allied air patrols had made surface transit suicidal. U-boats that surfaced during daylight got attacked by aircraft within minutes. Transit times to operational areas had doubled or tripled because boats had to remain submerged throughout the day, only surfacing briefly at night to recharge batteries. And the escorts had gotten better. Much better. Fiedler heard the Asdic pings intensify. He ordered a crash dive, standard procedure. Get to 150 feet, turn hard starboard, reduce speed to minimize noise, wait for the escorts to pass overhead, drop their depth charges, lose contact, then evade submerged. Except, Starling wasn't passing overhead. She was holding position at 800 yards, maintaining solid Asdic contact. And now a second ship had appeared on the hydrophone, high-speed screws, bearing 090 degrees, closing fast. Loch Killin was positioning for attack. Darling studied the plot in Loch Killin's operations room. The submarine was at 90 feet, moving at 4 knots on bearing 270 degrees. Perfect setup for Squid. His ship was at 600 yards and closing. At 400 yards, he'd give the firing order. The ASD operator had already set the fuses for 90 feet detonation depth. The system was automated, feeding data from the Asdic directly to the Squid's fire control. No manual calculation required. Just maintain contact, close to firing range, and execute. The mortars fired at 09:43 hours. 3 projectiles arced forward, splashing down in their triangular pattern 275 yards ahead of Loch Killin's bow. They sank at 43.5 feet per second, clockwork fuses counting depth. At 90 feet, they detonated simultaneously. The shock wave that hit U-333's pressure hull came from 3 directions at once: forward port, forward starboard, and directly ahead. 3 convergent blast waves, each carrying the explosive force of 207 pounds of mineral, meeting at the center of the triangle where the submarine happened to be. Post-war analysis would determine that convergent explosions like this created pressure waves approximately 3 times more powerful than the sum of individual explosions. The waves reinforced each other, amplifying rather than just adding. A single depth charge exploding 90 feet from a submarine might create a pressure spike of 10,000 pounds per square inch at the hull. 3 depth charges exploding simultaneously in triangular formation might create £35,000 per square inch or more. U-333's pressure hull was rated for survival at depths up to 750 feet, which translates to external pressure of about £330 per square inch. The hull could handle gradual pressure increases as the submarine dove deeper. It could handle shock waves from explosions that built up over milliseconds as the blast wave travelled through water. It could not handle £35,000 per square inch, arriving from 3 directions simultaneously in a convergent pattern that gave the steel no time to flex or distribute the force. The hull buckled inward amidships where the pressure wave hit hardest. Rivets sheared, welded seams split. Internal bulkheads, designed to contain flooding in one compartment, were overwhelmed. The pressure differential between the flooded forward sections and the still dry aft sections ripped bulkhead doors from their hinges. Electrical systems failed. Emergency lighting failed. The submarine became a steel tomb filling with freezing Atlantic water. The entire crew was gone in 90 seconds. On Loch Killin's Asdic, the operator reported breaking up noises. The distinctive sounds of structural failure, hull plates collapsing, machinery breaking loose from mounts, compressed air screaming from ruptured tanks. Then silence. Oil began spreading on the surface, visible from the deck. A spreading slick that marked where U-333 had been. Standard procedure called for boats to circle the area, watching for survivors. None appeared. German submarine doctrine emphasized that if your boat was doomed, you surfaced if possible, abandoned ship, and hoped for rescue. U-333 never got the chance to surface. She'd gone from operational submarine to shattered hull on the seafloor before her crew fully understood what had hit them. Lieutenant Commander Darling logged the kill at 0950 hours. HMS Starling was credited with assisting in the attack. Loch Killin was credited with the kill, using Squid anti-submarine mortar. This was history, the first confirmed submarine kill using the new weapon system. Squid had been fired in combat before. HMS Hadley Castle had made several attacks during her patrols. Other Loch-class frigates had used their Squids against submarine contacts. But U-333 was the first confirmed kill where the submarine definitely went down to Squid rather than to conventional depth charges or combined attacks. The validation was important because it proved the entire concept worked in combat conditions. The triangular pattern functioned as designed. The convergent blast waves were lethal. The Asdic integration allowed attacks while maintaining contact, and the psychological impact was exactly what the Wheezers and Dodgers had hoped for. U-boat crews couldn't evade what they couldn't predict. They'd spent years learning to dodge conventional depth charge patterns. Their doctrine was built around exploiting that 30-second blind window when Asdic contact was lost. Squid eliminated that window. The escort maintained Asdic contact throughout the attack. The submarine never went invisible. It never got those 30 seconds of evasion time. And the convergent blast pattern meant that small variations in the submarine's position didn't matter. If you were anywhere within that 40-yard triangle, you were in the kill zone. The tactical shift was profound. British anti-submarine doctrine had always emphasized persistence, make enough attacks, and eventually you'll get lucky. Squid changed it to precision. Make your attacks count because each one might be lethal. The numbers reflected this transformation. By the end of World War II, Squid had made 50 attacks against submarines, resulting in 17 kills. That's a ratio of 2.9 attacks per kill. Compare that to conventional depth charges at 60.5 attacks per kill. Squid was 20 times more effective at sinking submarines per attack than the weapon system it replaced. But the raw numbers don't capture the full impact. Squid didn't just sink more U-boats per attack, it changed U-boat behavior. German submarine commanders started receiving reports about this new weapon in late 1944. U-boat crews who survived encounters with Squid described attacks that violated everything they'd learned about British anti-submarine tactics. The escorts maintained sonar contact throughout the attack. The charges landed ahead of the submarine rather than behind it, and the explosions arrived simultaneously with devastating force, rather than in the sequential pattern they'd trained to survive. German Naval Command tried to develop counter-tactics. Stay deeper. Conventional wisdom suggested going to 200 feet was relatively safe from depth charges set to detonate at 150 feet. But Squid could be set to any depth up to 900 feet. The clockwork fuses were adjusted automatically based on ASDIC readings. If the submarine dove to 300 feet, the charges were set for 300 feet. Maneuver more aggressively. If small course changes during the blind window weren't enough, try large course changes as soon as you detect ASDIC contact. Turn 90 degrees, change depth significantly, make yourself a harder target to track. This worked sometimes against conventional attacks, but Squid's triangular pattern covered enough area that unless you maneuvered dramatically in the few seconds between detection and weapon launch, you were probably still inside the kill zone when the charges detonated. Run silent sooner. Conventional doctrine said to run silent after the attack started, shutting down non-essential equipment to reduce your acoustic signature once depth charges were falling. But Squid attacked while ASDIC had active contact. By the time you heard the first mortar fire, the projectiles were already in the air. Running silent after that was pointless. You'd need to run silent the moment you detected ASDIC pings, which meant operating at minimum capability throughout your entire patrol any time you were in areas where British escorts might be present. Captured German documents from late 1944 show increasing concern about Allied anti-submarine capabilities. A training memorandum from U-Boat Command noted that British escorts appeared to have developed a new forward-throwing weapon of exceptional lethality. The memorandum urged commanders to avoid engagement with escorts whenever possible, a dramatic shift from earlier doctrine that had emphasized aggressive tactics and persistence even under depth charge attack. The psychological impact was severe. U-boat crews had always known their service was dangerous. Casualty rates had been climbing steadily since 1943 as Allied anti-submarine measures improved. But there was a difference between dangerous and futile. As long as you could evade, as long as your skills and training gave you some chance of survival, crews could function. When a weapon emerged that didn't give you a chance to evade, that killed you before you could react, morale collapsed. Kriegsmarine records document increasing difficulty in finding volunteers for U-boat service in late 1944 and early 1945. Crews requested transfers to surface ships. Experienced petty officers took demotions to get off submarines. Training schools struggled to maintain student morale when every class heard stories about boats that simply vanished with no survivors, no explanation, just oil on the surface. HMS Loch Killin's war continued. 6 days after sinking U-333, on August 6th, she sank U-736 in the Bay of Biscay using conventional depth charges. The submarine had been caught on the surface, attempting to recharge batteries. Depth charges were still perfectly adequate for attacking submarines that were visible on the surface or detected in positions where Squid couldn't be brought to bear. On August 9th, Loch Killin participated in forcing U-608 to surface and scuttle. Then, on August 11th, she was part of attacks on U-385, which was eventually finished off by a Sunderland from RAF 641 Squadron. 4 U-boat actions in 11 days. The second escort group was demonstrating exactly why specialized anti-submarine vessels had been worth building. The Loch-class ships were proving their value not through balanced capability, but through focused effectiveness at their primary mission. In April 1945, Loch Killin added another kill to her tally. U-1063 was caught in the English Channel west of Land's End. This time, the kill came from a combination of gunfire and depth charges rather than Squid, demonstrating that crews were using whatever weapons were most appropriate for each tactical situation. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, 70 Loch-class frigates had been completed with Squid installations. Another 95 production installations had been manufactured for fitting to existing corvettes and destroyers. The weapon system that had been rushed into service as a barely tested prototype had become standard equipment on British anti-submarine vessels. Post-war analysis revealed just how revolutionary Squid had been. Trials conducted in 1946 using captured German submarines as targets showed that Squid was 9 times more effective than conventional depth charges in terms of lethal radius and probability of kill. 9 times. This wasn't incremental improvement, this was a fundamental leap in capability. But perhaps the most telling statistics came from German sources. U-Boat Command's operational records showed that from May 1943, when the tide of the Atlantic battle turned decisively against Germany, through war's end in May 1945, German submarine losses had averaged 17 boats per month. Allied depth charges had been responsible for about 30% of those losses throughout the war. But in the final year of the war, from May 1944 to May 1945, Squid and its predecessor Hedgehog accounted for nearly half of all U-boats sunk by escort vessels. Half? The forward-throwing weapons had become the primary means by which Allied escorts were killing submarines. The institutional resistance to Squid hadn't entirely vanished, even after combat proved its effectiveness. Some officers continued to argue that specialized anti-submarine vessels were a waste of resources. Captain Adams' concerns about sacrificing gun armament weren't entirely wrong. There were instances where Loch-class frigates encountered German destroyers or E-boats and found themselves outgunned in surface engagements. The counter-argument from Squid proponents was tactical. Don't engage enemy surface forces unless absolutely necessary. Your job is submarine, hunting. If you encounter surface threats, evade and call for appropriate support. This worked fine in the Atlantic, where British naval superiority meant support was usually available. It worked less well in other theatres where naval balance was less favourable. Nevertheless, the overwhelming success of Squid in its primary role drowned out the critics. By late 1944, the question wasn't whether to install Squid, but how quickly production could be ramped up to equip more vessels. The Royal Canadian Navy, initially sceptical, began requesting Squid installations for their escorts. The Royal Australian Navy followed suit. Even the United States Navy, which had developed its own forward-throwing weapons based on Hedgehog, expressed interest in Squid for some of their escort vessels. Squid's influence extended beyond World War II. The weapons system remained in service with the Royal Navy until 1977, 3 decades after the war ended. Type 61 frigate, HMS Salisbury became the last Royal Navy ship to fire Squid operationally when she conducted training exercises in April 1977. The Swedish Navy kept Squid in service even longer, using it on Östergötland-class destroyers until their decommissioning in 1982. Think about that. A weapon rushed into service as a barely tested prototype in 1943 remained frontline equipment for 40 years. The longevity came from Squid's fundamental soundness. The concept was correct: forward-throwing weapons, maintaining sonar contact throughout the attack and convergent blast patterns. The execution was robust enough that even 40 years later, with improvements in sonar and computers, the basic weapon system was still viable. Squid's successor, called Limbo, entered service in 1955. Limbo was essentially Squid improved with automation, stabilization, and increased range. Instead of manual loading, Limbo loaded automatically with the crew, under cover. Instead of a fixed mounting, Limbo had stabilization for pitch and roll, maintaining accuracy even in heavy seas. And instead of 275 yards range, Limbo could reach 1,000 yards. But the principle remained identical: 3 mortars firing depth charges in a triangular pattern, convergent blast waves, automated depth setting from sonar. Limbo remained in Royal Navy service until the 1980s. The Royal Canadian Navy used it through the 1990s on some ships. The fundamental insight that the Weasers and Dodgers had stumbled onto in 1942, that you could create devastating pressure waves by synchronizing multiple explosions in a geometric pattern, proved enduring. Modern anti-submarine warfare moved away from depth charges, entirely in favor of homing torpedoes and smart weapons. But during the critical years of World War II and through the Cold War submarine threat, Squid and its descendants represented the cutting edge of submarine killing technology. The psychological legacy was equally important. Squid broke the mythology surrounding submarine invulnerability. From World War I through early World War II, submarines had been considered nearly impossible to kill once submerged. They could dive beneath the surface, become invisible, and strike with near impunity. Escorts could hunt them, harass them, force them to break off attacks, but actually killing them required luck as much as skill. Squid changed that calculation. A submarine within range of a competent escort with Squid was in mortal danger. The convergent blast pattern eliminated safe evasion zones. The ASDIC integration eliminated the blind spot that had let submarines escape, and the forward-throwing geometry meant the submarine never got those critical 30 seconds to maneuver before weapons arrived. For U-boat crews, this transformation was existential. The submarine service had always had high casualty rates, but as long as survival was possible, as long as skill and training mattered, crews could function. When weapons emerged that killed regardless of your skill, morale collapsed. German submariners in late 1944 and 1945 understood that encountering a British escort with Squid was quite possibly a death sentence. The numbers validated their fear. Of the 17 U-boats sunk by Squid during the war, virtually all were total losses. Unlike conventional depth charge attacks where submarines sometimes made it to the surface after taking damage, allowing crews to abandon ship and survive, Squid kills were catastrophic. The convergent pressure waves crushed pressure hulls so completely that submarines sank immediately with all hands. U-333's fate was typical, not exceptional. 45 crew members, 0 survivors. The submarine went from operational to destroyed in seconds. No time to surface, no time to abandon ship, no chance for rescue. Just sudden, overwhelming violence followed by darkness and water. This lethality fed back into the strategic situation. As U-boat losses mounted and survival rates plummeted, Germany found it increasingly difficult to maintain adequate crew levels for their submarine fleet. Experienced sailors requested transfers out of submarines. New recruits understood they were volunteering for probable death. Training suffered because instructors couldn't maintain morale when everyone knew the odds. And tactical effectiveness declined because commanders became risk-averse, avoiding engagement when possible rather than pressing attacks aggressively. Squid contributed to this doom spiral. The weapon wasn't responsible for most U-boat losses. Aircraft, mines, conventional depth charges, and simple operational accidents killed far more submarines than Squid did. But Squid's 17 kills, and more importantly, the circumstances of those kills, sudden, unexpected, unsurvivable, had an outsized impact on German submarine morale and effectiveness. A weapon doesn't have to kill large numbers of enemies to be strategically significant. Sometimes killing a few enemies in ways that terrify the survivors is more valuable than killing many enemies in ways they understand and can cope with. Squid terrified U-boat crews because it violated the survival doctrine they'd relied on. It attacked in ways they couldn't predict. It struck while they were still invisible on sonar, eliminating the blind spot they'd exploited for years. And it killed with such sudden finality that the only difference between a successful evasion and total destruction was whether the crew happened to be in the wrong 40-yard triangle when the mortars fired. That's not combat, that's random death. And random death destroys morale faster than anything else. The engineers who developed Squid probably didn't fully understand these psychological dimensions when they were working out the weapon's technical details in 1942. They were solving a tactical problem, how to kill submarines more efficiently by maintaining sonar contact throughout the attack and using convergent explosions instead of sequential depth charges. The psychological impact was emergent, an unintended but devastating consequence of getting the technical details right. Modern military historians studying the Battle of the Atlantic generally conclude that Germany had lost the submarine war by mid-1943, before Squid entered widespread service. The turning point came in May 1943, Black May, when Allied escorts and aircraft sank 41 U-boats in a single month, forcing Admiral Dönitz to withdraw his submarines from North Atlantic convoy routes. Squid arrived too late to cause that turning point, but Squid ensured the turning point became irreversible. Even as Germany developed revolutionary Type XXI submarines with revolutionary capabilities, submerged speed of 17 knots, extended battery, life, streamlined hulls designed for underwater operation, the weapons existed to counter them. Type XXI boats would have rendered conventional depth charge tactics obsolete. They could outrun escorts while submerged. They could remain underwater for weeks. They could strike and evade without ever surfacing. But they couldn't outrun Squid. The forward-throwing capability meant escorts could attack while maintaining sonar contact. The convergent blast pattern meant evasion was difficult even at high speed. And the weapon's 900-foot depth capability meant Type XXI boats couldn't hide in deep water. Only 2 Type XXI submarines made operational patrols before Germany surrendered, and neither encountered British escorts equipped with Squid in combat. We'll never know definitively how that engagement would have played out, but post-war analysis suggested Squid would have been effective even against these advanced submarines. The convergent pressure wave principle worked regardless of the target's speed or depth. As long as sonar could maintain contact and the escort could close to firing range, Squid could engage. And Type XXI boats, for all their revolutionary design, still needed to come to periscope depth to navigate and attack, exposing themselves to detection. When HMS Loch Killin was scrapped in August 1960 at Newport, Wales, 16 years after sinking U-333, her Squid mortars were removed and sent to storage. Some may have been refurbished for installation on other vessels. Others probably went to museums or were broken up for scrap metal. The specific hardware that fired the first combat kill using Squid anti-submarine mortars likely doesn't exist anymore, but examples of the weapon system survive in museums. HMS Cavalier, a destroyer now preserved at Chatham Historic Dockyard in Kent, England, still has her Squid installation intact. Visitors can see the 3 mortar barrels, the mounting frame, the magazine where projectiles were stored. HMCS Hyder, preserved in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, has a similar installation. These preserved examples let modern viewers understand what Squid looked like and how it functioned, even though the mechanism's subtleties, the clockwork fuses, the ASDIC integration, the training and doctrine that made it effective, can't be fully appreciated from static display. The story of Squid exemplifies a pattern that appears repeatedly in military history, revolutionary capability emerging not from gradual improvement of existing systems, but from fundamental rethinking of the problem. Conventional depth charges represented generations of incremental refinement. Larger warheads, better fusing, improved throwing distance, coordinated patterns. Each improvement made depth charges somewhat more effective, but none changed the fundamental limitation that you lost sonar contact before weapons arrived. Squid didn't improve depth charges, it replaced the entire concept. Forward throwing, weapons maintaining contact while attacking, convergent blast patterns instead of sequential explosions, automated depth setting, eliminating manual calculation. Every element was different from conventional doctrine. And that's why it worked. The engineers at the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development weren't bound by conventional thinking because they weren't conventional officers. They were civilian engineers, retired officers with specialized knowledge, and active duty mavericks who'd been shuffled into this odd organization precisely because they didn't fit traditional naval culture. The Wheezers and Dodgers nickname wasn't entirely complimentary. It suggested a group of aging eccentrics cobbling together makeshift weapons. But those makeshift weapons, Hedgehog, Squid, and others, transformed naval warfare more effectively than many programs run by conventional bureaus with larger budgets and more prestigious personnel. Sometimes the mavericks and eccentrics see solutions that the experts miss precisely because they're not experts. They don't know what's impossible, so they try it anyway. Squid's success validated an approach to weapons development that prioritized rapid prototyping and field testing over extensive peacetime evaluation. The weapon went from drawing board to combat installation in less than a year. It was installed on ships while still technically in prototype phase. Crews worked out operational procedures during actual anti-submarine patrols rather than in extended training programs. By conventional standards, this was reckless. By wartime standards, it was necessary. The alternative was spending 2 years perfecting a weapon system while U-boats continued sinking merchant ships and starving Britain of supplies. Better to field a good enough weapon quickly than a perfect weapon eventually. Modern military acquisition programs could learn from this example. The pressure to get capability into the field quickly while accepting some technical risk and working out problems during operational use. But peacetime military bureaucracies are risk-averse, and careers are built on avoiding failures rather than accepting risks. So weapons programs stretch over decades, consuming vast budgets while requirements change and technologies evolve, and by the time the system finally deploys, it's often obsolete or irrelevant to current threats. Squid deployed in 8 months. 8 months from drawing board to combat use. It worked, and when it didn't work perfectly, crews adapted the doctrine to match the weapon's actual capabilities, rather than waiting for the weapon to be perfected. That's how you win wars. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.